Welcome, everybody. I'm Jessica Rodriguez. I'm the Data Science Institute's Industry Engagement and Outreach Officer. Welcome to our iCubed today. If you're not aware, iCubed stands for Institute, Industry, and Innovation. These are seminars which connect Data Science Institute industry affiliates with our students and larger Columbia community. It's an opportunity to explore topics at the forefront of industry. A data scientist, engineer, or researcher gives a talk about a recent project or case study. Today we have Shadi Fadaee with us, a data scientist from Vanguard. She is also a DSI MS alumni from 2019. This talk will discuss some natural language processing metrics found from the language of company earnings calls and assess how the metrics could explain subsequent price movements. Today's talk is earnings transcripts and managerial tone. Welcome, Shadi.
Thank you, Jessica. Hi, everyone. So today I am presenting an experiment on looking whether NLP metrics from earnings transcripts could be useful for alpha generation. So first, the agenda for today's talk. We'll go over the introduction of the topic and some literature review. And then I'll introduce the motivations and initial findings for our experiment. Then we'll go over the elements of tone that are important for our analysis and take a look at the data processing and the engineering pipeline. And then we'll look at the insights and outputs and our trading strategy. And finally close with some learnings and next steps. So today I'm presenting an initial experimentation that I worked on with another client coworker at Vanguard, Scott Rodemer, who is in the quantitative equity group at Vanguard. So Jessica introduced me, but a little more about me. I'm originally from Iran and I moved to the US to start my bachelor's. I was a Columbia DSI graduate, and then I joined Vanguard as a data scientist. For those of you who are not familiar with Vanguard, it's one of the world's largest investment companies that offers a large selection of mutual funds, ETFs, and other services with over $6.2 trillion of global assets under management. I joined Vanguard in the IMFS team, which is the Investment Management FinTech Strategies group. And in IMFS, we work with different groups at Vanguard to incorporate new technologies in the investment process. We like to experiment quickly to find ways that we can help the business. So with that, I wanted to first start with presenting kind of what an earnings transcript and what earnings calls are. So earnings transcripts are the text derived from earnings calls. An earnings call is a conference call between the management of a public company and analysts, investors, and media that join the call to discuss the company's financial results during a given period. These calls are usually held quarterly, and they're very important for investors and analysts as they closely scrutinize these calls for new insights and understanding of companies' internal dynamics. A call usually consists of two different sections. First, the management discussion and analysis, or the MD&A section. And during this section, the company management discusses the company's report of earnings. And then second, we have the Q&A section, where analysts and management are on a conference call, and analysts discuss and ask questions about what the company reported. And they ask questions about the performance, what they presented, and any discrepancies. Analysts and investors usually not only pay attention to what is presented, but also to any verbal cues from management that could indicate their overall sentiment and tone. Now, the usefulness of earnings transcripts and tonal information has been widely studied in academia. And in this presentation, me and Mr. Rodimer are using this academic studies and research to explore the value of metrics that we can derive based on earnings calls. So Mr. Rodimer, who is working on the active part of Vanguard, other than managing their funds, they spend time researching and exploring new data sets and technologies. So here we are talking about an initial experimentation that was encouraged by a lot of research that others did in academia. So here I want to give an overview of some of the research that guides our experiment. For example, one of the first paper looks at kind of negative tone and how this can relate to future earnings. So for example, they find that bleak tone changes predict lower future earnings and increased uncertainty. In another paper, Barth and others look at companies and they see that companies where managers blather more experience lower returns. They explain that blathering increases noise in the management message, and that increases uncertainty amongst investors. In another paper, Zhu finds that the ratio of numeric and textual content contains value-related information. And he states that management can hide poor performance using different tonal disclosures. So paying attention to this ratio could help us understand these dynamics. Another study, Barth and other associates find that in the Q&A section, obstructing the flow of information could lead to lower cumulative abnormal stock returns and also higher implied volatility. So they observe negative stock returns after an earnings call with a distinct avoidance of answers by the management. They call this non-answers, and they explain that this can take different forms, like refusal to provide information, or indirect or deceptive behavior, or blathering. Now, there also has been a lot of studies on applying deep learning techniques to better understand domain-specific context. Dogo Arachi introduces FinBERT as a language model based on BERT for NLP tasks in finance. He finds that with even a small training set for the domain of finance and fine-tuning a part of the BERT model, FinBERT outperforms other machine learning methods in sentiment analysis in the finance domain. Now, by using all this research and insights, I'm going to jump into explaining why this question of looking at earnings calls is important for us. So as I mentioned, QEG devotes some time in experimentation. And this experiment is important for many reasons. First, earnings transcripts are quite a rich data set for understanding management and analyst tone and understanding how this tone changes over time. Also, we find that generally models based on textual data show lower correlations with other factors than traditional models. And in addition to these, discussions in transcripts are often forward-looking, so talking about the future performance, and especially in the Q&A section. This forward-looking nature of these interactions can be complementary to fundamental data that is often backward-looking based on past performance. And finally, it is important for us to incorporate new technologies in order to see where we can derive value and where we shouldn't spend time on. So analysis of financial texts, be it news, analyst reports, or earnings and transcripts, could be a possible source of new information. And with the increasing volume of text generated every day, it is difficult for analysts to stay on top of all of these. So for the case of QEG, we would like to look at finding NLP metrics that could help us find where we can derive alpha. And in other cases, for more qualitative understanding, we want to see if finding ways of using NLP methods could help us reduce time that is spent on manually analyzing these documents. So now I want to first present some of our initial findings for our initial experimentation. We find that some aspects of tone in these calls can differentiate stock returns in the near and medium term. In some instances, more complexity in the models and in how we set up our analysis improves performance and signal stability. But as seen in other cases in machine learning, in some other instances, increased complexity does not improve performance. We also find that metadata to distinguish between the different speakers and sections of the call helps us incorporate context into our research. So for example, whether a remark is by a CEO or if it's a question by a specific analyst or so on. And this can improve our results. And lastly, and not surprisingly, we find that pre-processing of this data requires significant effort and is quite important for the final output and the type of output. Now, let's dive in. First, let's discuss understanding tone. This understanding tone in earnings calls could help us understand company behaviors. Analysts, as discussed, intuitively look for clues in these calls to estimate future performance. And we want to quantify what is intuitively understood from the tone of speakers to gain insight into how companies are performing. Now, tone is a complex subject that can be explained in a variety of ways. And in order to quantify tone, we chose the aspects that are most important for our initial experiment. So first, widely known, is sentiment analysis, which is the task of extracting sentiments or opinions of people from written language. So here we want to see whether we can understand the underlying sentiment of a remark and whether this sentiment can help us flag favorable or unfavorable events. Although many financial concepts are neutral in nature, the semantic orientation of concepts that are expressed in these interactions could help us understand what we should expect from a company going forward. Now, financial sentiment analysis is quite challenging because of the limitations. Firstly, it's the limitation of the specialized nature of the language in finance and the context, and most importantly because of the lack of labeled data in the domain. Now, another aspect of tone that we wanted to look at is deception. Here we want to see if we can identify elements of tone that show evasiveness. So can we find metrics that enable us to identify whether management is either hiding information or evading questions or trying to distract the audience to avoid giving clear responses? So for example, if management is in response to a question about a specific performance criteria, uses a lot of filler words and long sentences without providing factual responses, this might be a sign of evasiveness. So the dominance of non-factual information over factual information could be an evidence for this. Another way that we can understand evasiveness is by identifying specific terms that might signal uncertainty or misleading information. Now, finding deception in tone is even more challenging because first, it is dependent on the context in which it appears, and second, because it is just difficult to find all the terms that might signal deception, and also because these terms might evolve through time. Now, after identifying elements of tone that could be interesting to look at, we want to go about quantifying these elements. First, for sentiment analysis. Here we're using research done by other researchers in order to quantify sentiment. So we look at 3 different approaches in this experiment. First, and that is the simplest and most widely used method in finance, especially, is counting the number of positive and negative words in a sentence. Here we use a carefully designed financial sentiment lexicon that was developed by law firm McDonald that incorporates financial knowledge into textual analysis. However, this method is based on word counting, so it doesn't look at the deeper semantic meaning of a text. So we move to the second method. We look at Vader. A lot of you might be familiar with Vader as its increased popularity. It is a lexicon and rule-based sentiment analysis tool that incorporates a gold standard sentiment lexicon validated by human judges. But what is important about Vader is that it's sensitive to both the polarity, which means positive or negative, and the intensity of sentiments that are expressed. So unlike word counting methods, this incorporates word order sensitive relationships that take into account language constructs. So here we use Vader to analyze the sentiment of each sentence by taking a compound score of all the valence scores of each word in the sentence. However, we know that Vader was especially curated for analyzing sentiment in social media contexts. And we know that financial sentiment analysis is quite different from general sentiment because the goal of financial sentiment analysis is deducing how the markets would react to the information presented. So we move to the last method that we looked at. This was the Finbert sentiment classification model. As I alluded to earlier, Finbert is a pre-trained language model that was built by further training the BERT language model in the finance domain. So BERT is now a very famous pre-trained unsupervised language model developed by Google. is basically an unsupervised neural network that was trained on a lot of documents to better understand language and context. So Finbert takes the BERT language model and fine-tunes it on a labeled financial dataset. The primary dataset that the researchers use for pre-training is called the Financial Phrase Bank, developed by Mallow, that consists of about 5,000 sentences that were taken randomly from financial news and annotated by human judges according to how they think the sentence might affect the company's stock price. Finbert researchers find that using this small training set actually enables us to improve the results for sentiment classification in the finance domain. So here in our experiment, we use the Finbert's sentiment classification to classify the sentiment of sentences in our corpus by taking the highest probability class amongst three classes of positive, negative, and neutral sentiment. Now, this concludes the sentiment signals that we looked at. So let's look at the second aspect of tone, which is deception. As discussed, deception aims to find language structures that might be associated with people trying to hide the truth. Here, our first metric that we talked about earlier is to measure how much factual information is present as opposed to non-factual information. So we take this ratio for each interaction. The second metric uses a list of trigrams that are basically 3-word phrases that are associated with evasiveness, or as the researchers who developed these glossaries call it, non-answers. These phrases were developed by researchers who used supervised machine learning on a large training set of Q&As in earnings transcripts that enabled them to come up with more than 1,000 trigrams that signal non-answers. So we use this list of trigrams to identify sentences that contain evasive phrases, such as back to you or hard to predict. These are examples of some of these phrases that were found to be strong markers for non-answers. Now, we also looked at other metrics, such as uncertainty, readability indices, and language complexity, but that's not our focus for today. So now that we talked about our metrics, let's discuss the data set and methodologies. So in order to understand what we're doing, it's important to talk about the process to actually get the data and prepare it for analysis. When I entered the world of finance, I got introduced to the type of data here, which is very dirty and very massive. So a large part of any work with data is dedicated to just preparing the data. So there are a lot of details here, but this only scratches the surface of what we had to do. Our data includes a broad history of quarterly earnings transcripts for companies on the Russell 3000 index from about 1999 to the end of 2020. Each transcript is a JSON file that includes metadata about the company, the date, the speakers, their titles, and so on. And this metadata enables us to track the different sections of the call, the different speakers such as CEO, CIO, analyst, operator, or the type of remark, whether it be question or answer. So by this, we first parse these JSON files to extract the text and encode information about the speakers. And by this process, we parse more than 175,000 transcripts and then save these results. Now, having this data of kind of processed text, then we apply some general pre-processing steps. This includes removing some noisy text, such as good afternoon, for some of our analysis that would be sensitive to these phrases. And now one of the steps that we did was to apply to parse the text into sentences. And this enables us to analyze tone in the most granular level. Now, let's look at the process flow. So here we start with a list of companies on the Russell 3000. And then we get the transcript JSONs from a database and parse them and save the results to the cloud. And we use S3 buckets in Amazon AWS. Now, the next step is to apply our metrics that we developed on these sentences in each transcript. And we did this part in multiple steps. Here we use notebook instances on Amazon SageMaker that enabled us to leverage multiple cores to multi-process the data. So for example, to get a sense of the volume of the data, to get the Finbert sentiment classification, even without training any models, we used 2 notebooks, each with 96 cores, and that took about a week to finish. Then we save these results to the cloud, and so we have our analyzed transcripts. So the next step is to assess how our models have performed. As we don't have training data, our next best test of how the metrics are working, and the easiest way to do this is to look at the results and use our human intuition, because we know what negative sentiment looks like. And this kind of intuitive testing, I find that is helpful, especially when interacting with business partners who like to see concrete examples and insights to help their understanding. Now, we're all familiar with Elon Musk, and we know that he's not the most circumspect of management. So the following paragraph was taken from Tesla's earnings call in 2018. It was marked by our metrics as having very negative sentiment and uncertainty. Intuitively, when we look at these remarks, we see that they signal a lot of risk and uncertainty. So some might deduce that the stock price will likely fall as a result of the presented information. So here it seems like at first glance, our metrics are able to pick up on some of the tone aspects that we intuitively look for, especially when looking at Finbert. Looks like it captures some contextual understanding of tone elements in this financial domain. And here you can see that the different approaches are different in some of the examples. So using all of them helps us understand the aspects of tone that they're able to capture. And it's also helpful to see the variation in scores in developing an understanding, especially when working with our business partners. So now with this initial empirical analysis, let's look at the dynamics of these tone metrics over time. Here we're looking at, on the left-hand side, at the sentiment of prepared remarks, questions, and answers. Here we see that generally prepared remarks by the management are more positive than their unprepared answers in the Q&A section. Also in the Q&A section, we find that on average, analyst questions tend to be the most neutral sentiment. Now, on the right-hand side, we see the sentiment in the MD&A section as grouped by different sectors. So it's interesting to see here the dip that happens during the global financial crisis that was between 2007 and 2009. Here we see a broad decline in sentiment that was followed by a reversion after this period. And also here, looking across sectors, we see that there is time variation, considerable time variation in sentiment. Now that we have these tone metrics calculated, the next step is to assess whether they are useful for alpha generation. So in order to do this, one way to assess is to apply backtesting strategies. So a quick overview of what backtesting is the general method for seeing how well a strategy would have done ex post. So this means that we assess the performance of a trading strategy by looking at how it would have played out using historical data. So this allows us to simulate our trading strategy using historical data to generate results and assess risk and profitability. So here we are using a very simple trading strategy that's often referred to as long-short strategy. This type of strategy takes a long position in stocks that are expected to outperform or that are underpriced, while selling short those that will underperform or that are overpriced. So first, on each month, we normalize our tone metrics and then aggregate them to a compound score within our universe. Then we sort these metrics from the most attractive to least attractive within peer groups. And then we bucket this sorted data to different buckets. So here, the first bucket includes our most attractive stocks, and the last bucket includes the least attractive stocks. And lastly, we calculate returns to a strategy that buys the highly ranked stocks, so bucket 1, and sells the least attractive, rebalancing monthly. In this presentation, we're not including transaction costs, and our sample for backtesting is from December of 2004 until December of 2019. So let's look at the results for this strategy. Here on the left-hand side, we see the presentation metrics, which is the MD&A part. We're looking at the cumulative long-short performance rebalanced monthly. On the right-hand side, we see the Q&A analyst sentiment, Q&A management sentiment, and Q&A deception. So here, generally, we see that the metrics are showing some promising results for generating excess returns. But the amount of returns that they generate depends on the type of metric that is used, any kind of processing that we do after we analyze these metrics, and the section of the call that they're used on. Now, another consideration for investors is looking at alpha decay. So here, excess returns that decay more slowly require less trading, and that increases the signal's potential to add value in a portfolio. So that means that it is important for us to understand what the duration of the value in these signals is. By this, we see that Finbert shows the most persistent alpha and stable rankings as compared to other sentiment models that require much more turnover. So here, the takeaway is that complexity in this case improves the decay profile, as mentioned earlier. Now, with this, these insights from the trading strategies, and by looking at the historical performance of a strategy based on these metrics, we see that there are some promising insights in the ability to generate alpha using the tone of earnings calls. Now, this presentation shows our initial experimentation using the research that we leveraged. So the promising results here indicate that a deeper understanding of these metrics, and especially training the models on derived labels, could be valuable for our strategies. And this encourages us to dive deeper into new experimentation. So going forward from here, there are multiple learnings that guide our next efforts. Some of these are corresponding to the investment strategy considerations. Here we should look at correlations with signals that improve returns with other traditional equity factors like earnings surprises. Now, another consideration is that trading requirements could clarify what signal work for different users and different use cases. So for example, we saw that some sentiment signals typically require higher turnover to capture the information, which raises trading costs. So the different types of metrics might work for some traders, whereas for other traders, it would be too much trading to be able to derive value. Now, for the model design, we can now tune our models based on these insights that we found to train and customize the models based on a number of variables that we found. Now, our next step would be to analyze the Q&A section that we think offers a great opportunity for increased insights. Here we want to refine our deception measures to, for example, look at different vectorizations for questions and answers or embeddings to understand how well does an answer correspond to a question in order to understand evasiveness and behavior in these interactions. Now, another opportunity is looking at and assessing topics in these calls. So topics could be anything for example, the COVID or dividend events, and assessing topics in these calls could help us identify the importance of a topic on a call for a company based on the time that they spent on this topic. And we can, for example, compare the topic importance across companies to perhaps derive how heavily did a specific topic influence or affect that company's performance. Now, another way that we can look at these topics is to understand sentiment and tone related to a topic and compare this tone behavior from management with analysts. And now also, it would be very interesting to look at these tone behaviors across topics over time to understand the dynamics of these topics, their importance throughout time for different companies and investors. Now, with this, I end my presentation. I hope that this presentation helps the audience get a better understanding of the applications of NLP in finance, its limitations, the type of data, and the rich variety of research done in this space in academia. Thank you for listening to me. And with that, I will end the presentation and open for discussions.
Thank you so much, Shadi. That was wonderful. Let me make sure. Sorry. Okay, great. So let's jump into the Q&A section and see if we can tackle some of these questions. So the first question is, have you studied what is human-to-human agreement for deception or evasiveness of an utterance? My experience is that there is a high degree of subjectivity in these labels, especially for deception.
So I would be interested to get some clarification, but if my response doesn't correspond to your question, please let me know. I think what you're saying is that deception and these signals differ from individual to individual, and that is a correct assumption. We actually do see this depending on, for example, different CEOs, different analysts, the type of signal and what it captures does differ. So that's actually another reason why metadata about the speaker, for example, tracking the specific names of analysts that tend to ask hard questions and analyze the answers to those really helps us understand these dynamics. And you are very correct in your assumption.
Thank you. Our next question is a question over sentiment analysis results of Finbert. They have done a sentiment analysis on ER calls with Vader, which provided them no signals since they were pretty similar scores. I'm wondering the difference between ER call sentiment scores while using Finbert. Thanks. What do you think?
Not sure if I completely understand, but Finbert does perform much better than Vader in finance. So especially in earnings transcripts, Finbert performs the best across the different models, also Vader. So Vader is generally a pretty good model for understanding general behavior, the general sentiment. But as it was kind of curated for social media, and because it was curated for short sentences, it does not necessarily apply as well to finance. So Finbert performs much better in our analysis. And as you saw in our examples, Finbert captures context of finance much better than Vader.
Right. So I'm not sure if you can answer these, and if you can, that's great. If not, we'll go. What is Vader's score? Is it the compound score, post-neg, or something else?
Yes. So the Vader, what we use from Vader is the compound score, which is a compound score of the valence scores of the words in the sentence. So we use that as kind of a unidimensional measure of the sentiment of that sentence. So we take that measure, which both includes intensity and the sign, which tells us if it was negative or positive.
Awesome. I'm going to skip to some of the more recent questions just so we can mix it up a little bit. What length of time series for price target do you analyze post-call? E.g. after hours trading calls, during calls versus price over the whole quarter between calls?
Great question, and something that is very important for strategies and for trading strategies. So here we usually use, as I said, we rebalance monthly, but the way that we track prices is usually by the closing price on each day. So we do not look at intraday trading. And that is specifically because of the way that investors at Vanguard work, which is that we usually don't trade quickly. So that behavior is not important for our use cases.
Great, thank you. This question, did you add any bias metrics for the speaker/CEO? I'm guessing the different CEOs might use different voice tones or different vocabularies.
Again, a great question. So we, in our initial experiment, we did not want to assume any bias by our findings. But after we analyzed, we went and looked at specific, for example, CEOs that we knew have been evasive in the past. So, for example, the infamous Nissan CEO that might have known about the news. Um, by kind of looking at the subset of his interactions, we're able to find very kind of direct and clear patterns in how he uses language. So that is very important in more granular analyses. For example, if you're trying to track a specific company, then I would say that it would make sense to include bias in your results if indeed you have seen that intuitively and tested.
Thank you. How did you decide on such a large data set? How did you decide which data to include and exclude, especially if the model took a week to train?
So first of all, correction here is that we, because of lack of labeled data, we did not train any model. So we used a already pre-trained model to apply it for our use case. Now, why we use such a big data set? In the portfolios that we're interested in building, they're based on the Russell 3000 index, which is a list of 3,000 companies in the US. Now, in order to get any statistically significant understanding of whether a strategy works or not, we usually require at least 10 years of data. And by kind of increasing the universe, we're able to have a representative sample of different sectors, different companies, and different timelines. So that was a requirement for us to both be able to um, kind of output these results for a wide universe for analysis for different groups at Vanguard to assess how they're working. And most importantly, in order to be able to have results that we can claim as significant, not biased by a small sample.
Thank you. Let's go back up. Could you briefly describe how you ascribe sentiment to specific topics?
So I think that question is about the next steps that I discussed.
Okay.
So currently I have not ascribed sentiment to topics, but I believe a way that we can experiment with this is to apply different topic modeling schemes and then assess the sentiment corresponding to that topic by either looking at the embeddings in that topic or the words in that topic or the sample set in that topic to understand the overall sentiment correlated with that topic. Now we can do this in kind of a less granular topic level or a specific topic in specific transcripts in a specific time period.
Let's see. Did you integrate information from the earnings reports released alongside the call or only the transcripts of the call?
Great question, because earnings reports are also important, but they're a different type of data set. So we only looked at earnings transcripts because what we wanted to look at was the behavior of management and analysts that would not be kind of included in a report, which is mostly report of the earnings. And it was important for us to understand how these earnings are actually discussed by management and how they're scrutinized by analysts by observing the interactions in the calls.
Let me see. We do have a few questions that got popped into the chat. Are the evasive data sets open resource?
I believe so.
Okay.
So the dataset was based on a paper that was called Acon Linguistics by Barth and Mansouri and other fellow researchers. I believe you should be able to find this paper online, and the trigrams, I'm not sure if you can access it freely, but worth a check.
Thank you. Let's try this one. How realistic would it be to create a sentiment and evasiveness labeled corpus using crowdsourcing, such as AMT, with measures to ensure high integrated consistency?
I think that's something that I would have loved to do, to have a labeled data set or to get someone to label the data set. In the ideal world, it would be, it could be practical, but in the case of when we're trying to experiment, that requires a lot of kind of resources and time. And in the business, it is not deemed quite practical at this stage. But there is other ways of labeling the data. So for example, by labeling by returns, but that comes after proof of concept of analyzing these kind of dynamics, but you can label these data sets and test how they're performing.
This person asked, we understand that this project is more of an experiment for your team, but would still like to know how frequently are such models actually used in the industry?
I can't comment on how they're used in the industry. I can comment in our use cases at Vanguard. So we, in different groups, we try to dedicate a portion of our time and commitment to innovative techniques and in experimentation. So I would say that we don't have strategies built on these specific metrics right now, but we do dedicate time and effort in analyzing and assessing, and not only in the active group, but across other teams to derive value.
That's wonderful. That's how innovation happens, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly.
And it's wonderful for our students to know about that culture of Vanguard, that there's that space for exploration. How was the performance of this approach compared to market benchmark?
So these were all kind of included, well, in the trading strategy, you kind of adjust for the market. So our benchmark was close to, we can approximate to say it was the Russell 3000. So any market effect is taken out. So the effect that you see here, the excess returns, they're excess to the market.
Wonderful, thank you. How do you handle data leakage in the pertaining of BERT on public news corpus, e.g. coverage of mortgage back-end securities and earning calls around 2009/10?
So again, we did not pre-train the Finbird model ourselves. We used the Finbird model that researchers, including Doug Gorachi, pre-trained on this phrase bank. Now, I would recommend reading the paper. He uses a lot of interesting methods for example, catastrophic forgetting. And that is something that happens when you pre-train a model. It could be that the deeper levels would forget the information in the original trained model. So catastrophic forgetting is something that needs to be handled. Now for data leakage, refer to the paper, but for any kind of analysis, that is definitely a primary check for having training and test sets that do not allow for that. And also for data leakage, it's very important to not have kind of future bias. So when you're looking at financial, for example, information, it's very important that you don't look at, for example, 2019 in your training set and try to test on, for example, 2018. You have to be very cognizant of the time series nature of financial data. So that is a very, very important consideration.
When you say universe, is this a graph representation of the embeddings or another reference?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, thank you. Well, this person said thank you. Lots of people said thank you for the wonderful presentation, by the way. But when you say universe, is this a graph representation of the embeddings or of another reference?
I'm not sure which universe they're referring to. So there's the universe of stocks that I keep mentioning, that's Russell 3000. By the embeddings, if you're talking about the next steps of including embeddings and analyzing evasiveness in Q&As, graph representation could be a way, I suppose. I've not thought about that. I was not thinking about in terms of graph, but in terms of comparing the embedding space of, for example, a question and answer, and seeing how closely they sit in that embedding space as a measure of how closely an answer correlates with its corresponding question.
Do you factor in actual quarterly performance against the specific analyst forecast to calibrate the sentiment?
So we about the quarterly performance, by this backtesting strategy, we are taking the actual performance to build this strategy and test it. But the analyst revisions, that is a different data set that is also very important in perhaps using as a training set or for kind of controlling for the freedom of our models, but we did not include that in this experiment that was presented here.
Did you weigh different analyst questions answers differently? Some analysts are known to ask management-friendly questions.
Great question. I think another question was asking about the same thing. So in our initial experimentation, we did not want to weight or bias any data, but we know and we see that specific analyst questions are actually more important for looking. So it would be important to track analyst X, who tends to ask really good questions that confuse the management, and track those interactions in companies. So we do not weight those, but we do kind of at this stage to not affect the kind of results, but it requires and it would be valued to look at specific analysts or specific CEOs for that matter, any management that we have assumptions about their performance or questions.
Wonderful. Thank you. And we have time for one more question, one more minute. What are your thoughts on the real or perceived compliance issues of using deep learning in the financial industry? How do we feel about answering this? Whether the training data contains information that cannot be used or difficult to interpret, how DL models produce certain outputs?
So I think that's that requires a wide conversation, but I would say that in the case of BERT, we're using a language model that was trained on kind of like a huge corpus of English text from any context. And we believe that that built a language understanding and context that does not necessarily affect affect the bias of our study, because we're using these deep learning methods as language models, not for a specific kind of task. And then we build upon that by pre-training. There are definitely concerns in any deep learning models because of the black box nature and because we don't know what is going on. But taken with the real world assumptions that feeding in financial data that are important for us. So for example, it would be very important that you're pre-training on a data set that you actually care about. If you control for these, then I believe that the advantages overweight the disadvantages.
Thank you. Shadi, it has been wonderful having you participate in our iCubed seminar. It's even more wonderful that you're an alumnus. Thank you so much. We've received lots of thank yous through the chat and through the Q&A. Your talk was wonderful, and we hope to have you back soon.
Thank you, everyone, for the great questions and the dialogue, and thank you for having me.